On the edge of town, where the fog never truly lifts and the trees whisper secrets to the wind, stands an aging Victorian mansion. The house is a monument to time itself, its walls heavy with the burden of forgotten stories, its windows like vacant eyes staring into a past long buried. No one dares venture past the rusting wrought iron gate, not out of law but of fear. Within its shadowy halls lives Eleanor Vale, a woman as much a ghost of the past as the house she inhabits. To the townspeople, she is an enigma, a specter in widow's black who never speaks, never shops, never prays at the chapel. She walks through the town on rare occasions, her movements deliberate, her posture regal yet sorrowful, her eyes holding an ache that is never dulled. Rumors whisper that she has not aged in decades, that she was once a woman of stunning beauty, who captured men's hearts with just a glance, only for tragedy to strike every suitor who dared to love her. Some say she is cursed. Others say she is the curse. But what none of them know is that Eleanor Vale is neither myth nor monster. She is a prisoner of fate, shackled to a destiny she never chose, doomed to witness love turn to death over and over again. Once, long ago, Eleanor was just a girl, no different from any other, save for the weight of beauty that made men foolish and women wary. She was not born with a curse, nor did she seek one. It came to her as curses often do, not in the form of an ominous warning, not in a bolt of lightning splitting the sky, but in a choice, a single moment of weakness, a desire whispered into the wrong ears. It was the night of her engagement to Samuel Holloway, a man of warmth and kindness, who loved her not for her beauty, but for the way she saw the world. But Eleanor had always feared time. She had watched the women around her wither under the years, their faces creased with worry, their hands calloused from labor, their love stories ending not in passion, but in quiet resignation. She longed to be timeless, to preserve the magic of youth and romance forever. And so, when an unfamiliar figure cloaked in darkness appeared outside her window, promising her the eternity she craved, she listened. The price, he said, was simple. She would never lose her beauty, but any man who loved her, truly, deeply, unconditionally, would pay with his life. Eleanor had laughed then, thinking it a foolish jest. After all, love was fickle. Men fell in love as easily as they forgot. She believed she could outsmart fate, that she could have loved without allowing it to take root. But the next morning, Samuel Holloway was found lifeless in his bed, his face frozen in an expression of heartbreak, his hands clutching the locket Eleanor had given him the night before. And that was the day Eleanor Vale realized she had traded her soul for a curse that would never let her go. Eleanor did not ask for admirers, but they came all the same, drawn to her as moths to a flame, each one convinced that they would be the exception. They came bearing flowers, poetry, whispered promises of devotion, believing their love was strong enough to rewrite destiny. And one by one they fell. A sailor who carved her name into the wood of his ship, drowned at sea the night he professed his love. A poet who wrote sonnets about her never awoke from his sleep after leaving his final letter at her doorstep. A widower who thought himself too old for foolish romance died in his garden with her name on his lips. Love, Eleanor learned, was not a gift but a noose tightening around the throats of those who dared care for her. And so, she stopped speaking to men. She stopped meeting their eyes, stopped acknowledging the way they looked at her with reverence and longing. She buried herself in the solitude of her mansion, hoping that, in time, the world would forget her. But curses do not fade with time. They linger, relentless and cruel, and the more Eleanor tried to escape, the more she felt the weight of it crushing her. It was not just the deaths that haunted her. It was the moments before, the fleeting seconds of happiness, the way their eyes lit up in the instant before fate snatched them away. She had thought she wanted to be timeless, but eternity without love was nothing more than a prison with invisible bars. By the time the town came to understand what Eleanor Vale was, it was too late. They had seen too many funerals, buried too many good men, and whispered too many theories about the woman in the black dress who never shed a tear. It did not matter that she had tried to isolate herself, that she had begged fate to undo what had been done, that she had suffered more than any of them could imagine. All that mattered was that she was dangerous. The older women clutched their rosaries when they saw her, muttering prayers under their breath, as if her very presence was an affront to God. The men avoided her entirely, afraid to fall victim to the same unseen force that had taken so many before them. The children, unaware of the full truth, turned her into a legend, a witch, a monster, a ghost that haunted a mansion at the edge of town. They dared each other to run up to her gate and touch it, laughing nervously as they sprinted back before she could spot them. But Eleanor never chased them away. She only watched, her heart heavy with the weight of knowing that even the innocent feared her. She had long since accepted that she would never again know the warmth of companionship, never again hear the laughter of friends, never again feel the comfort of belonging. And yet, no matter how much she told herself she deserved this exile, there was a part of her that still longed for something more, a part of her that wondered if there was still a way to break the chains of her own making. It was Daniel, a traveling journalist with ink-stained fingers and an insatiable hunger for truth, who shattered the careful silence of Eleanor Vale's existence. He came to the town under the pretense of documenting its history, but his interest quickly turned to the woman everyone feared. He asked questions, pressing for details, intrigued by the contradiction between the town's horror and the sorrow he saw etched into Eleanor's face from a distance. He did not believe in curses. He believed in stories, in people, in the wounds time left behind, and he wanted to know hers. Against the town's warnings, he approached the gates of the mansion, calling out her name with an audacity no one else had dared. Eleanor should have ignored him. She should have let him walk away, let him be another stranger who left without answers. But when she stepped onto the porch and saw him standing there, his expression not one of fear, but of curiosity, something deep within her stirred. A long-forgotten whisper of hope, of a life beyond the walls of her prison. But she had learned her lesson long ago. Hope was a cruel thing, a liar wrapped in gold. And as she met Daniel's gaze, she felt the weight of fate shifting, an unseen force awakening, the whisper of a story already being written. She knew how this would end. And yet, against every instinct, against every warning in her bones, she let him in. Eleanor had spent a lifetime mastering the art of distance, keeping people at arm's length, building walls invisible yet impenetrable, ensuring that no man ever dared to love her. It was the only way to survive. But Daniel was not like the others. He did not arrive with flowers in hand or poetry on his lips. He did not look at her as a legend to unravel or a prize to claim. He saw her as a woman, not a myth, and that terrified her. When he returned to her gate day after day, undeterred by her silence, Eleanor felt the familiar stirrings of something she had buried long ago, hope. But hope, she knew, was a cruel trickster, a thing that whispered promises it never kept. So she did what she had always done. She resisted. She spoke in clipped sentences, gave nothing away, and warned him again and again to leave while he still could. But Daniel was a man of questions, and silence only made him hungry for answers. "Why do you fear me?" he asked one evening, standing just beyond the rusted gate, his voice calm but insistent. Eleanor turned away, her hands trembling at her sides. "I do not fear you, Mr. Ashford. I fear what loving you will do." She had never said aloud before, never admitted that love was her greatest enemy. But Daniel only smiled, undeterred. "Then don't love me," he said simply. "Just tell me your story." And for the first time in decades, Eleanor Vale hesitated, because she knew, once she let someone in, fate would never let them leave unscathed. On the night Eleanor finally relented and allowed Daniel inside her home, the air grew heavier, thick with a presence unseen yet deeply felt. The mansion had been silent for years, its walls holding the echoes of 1,000 unspoken regrets, its halls walked only by a woman burdened with too many ghosts. But with Daniel there, the house seemed awake, stretching its ancient bones, stirring its slumbering spirits. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes tracing the grandeur of the decaying chandeliers, the worn-out velvet drapes, the portraits of long-dead lovers whose fates had been sealed the moment they dared to care for her. "This place," he murmured, trailing his fingers over a dust-coated piano. "It feels like it remembers." Eleanor swallowed hard, folded her hands to still their shaking. "It does." That night, as Daniel sat in the parlor, flipping through old letters, the house made its displeasure known. The floorboards groaned without weight. The candlelight flickered despite the absence of wind. A whisper, distant yet intimate, curled through the air. "Leave now." Daniel stiffened, glancing at Eleanor, but she only closed her eyes as if she had heard it 1,000 times before. "They don't want you here," she said, her voice steady, resigned. "And they will do everything in their power to make sure you don't stay." But Daniel, ever the stubborn journalist, only leaned forward, his expression unshaken. "Then they'll have to try harder." The fire crackled low, casting golden light against the cavernous walls, illuminating Eleanor's face in flickering shadows. She sat across from Daniel, her hands folded in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. He had spent weeks asking, prying, demanding the truth from her. Now, she was ready to tell it. "I was young," she began, her voice laced with something close to shame. "And I was foolish. I thought I could trick fate, that I could have loved without consequence. I was wrong." She spoke of the night she had made the deal, of the faceless figure who had granted her beauty and time at the cost of every man who loved her. She spoke of Samuel Holloway's death, of the others who had followed, of the way she had spent the rest of her existence running from the curse she had sealed herself into. Daniel listened, unmoving, his hands clasped together. He had expected something tragic, something painful, but the weight of her words was suffocating. "And now," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, "you understand why you must leave." But Daniel did not flinch. He did not look at her with fear, nor with pity. Instead, he reached for her hand, hesitant yet certain, his fingers brushing against hers in a gesture so simple yet so devastating that it stole the breath from her lungs. "Love isn't possession, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "It isn't something you can claim or lose. It's something you give freely. And I don't intend to stop giving it just because fate says I should." Eleanor jerked her hand away, standing so quickly that the candlelight shuddered. "Then you will die." Daniel only exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That's not your choice to make." But Eleanor knew better. It had never been her choice. It had always belonged to the curse. And it was only a matter of time before it came to collect. The night after Eleanor revealed the truth, she waited for Daniel to leave. She watched the clock, expecting him to pack his things, to turn his back on the doomed woman and the haunted house that had claimed so many before him. But the morning came, and he was still there. "You are making a mistake," she told him as he sat in her study, scribbling in his notebook. He did not look up. Probably. Frustration coiled inside her like a vice. "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice measured, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "I understand that love isn't something you can protect people from. I understand that fear doesn't stop death. It stops life. And I understand that if I leave, I'll regret it for the rest of my days." Eleanor turned away, her hands clenched. No one had ever defied the curse before. No one had ever willingly walked into its grasp. "You're a fool." "Maybe," he admitted. "But if love is a risk, then I'd rather take it than spend my life running from something that may never come." Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love was stronger than fate, that the past could be rewritten. But the house whispered otherwise. The shadows slithered beneath the doors. And in the deepest corner of her soul, she knew Daniel had just made the worst mistake of his life. It began slowly, a flickering candle extinguishing without cause, a chill creeping through the air despite the summer night. Then the whispers grew louder, no longer words but wails, howls of fury and grief that rattled the glass in its frames. The house had been patient, but Daniel's defiance had awoken something ancient, something that would not tolerate love in a place meant only for sorrow. The moment he stepped toward Eleanor, the walls trembled, portraits crashed to the floor, the chandelier swayed, its crystals clinking like laughter from the dead. Then the figure appeared, a shape formed from shadows, tall and faceless, its voice 1,000 voices entwined. "You were warned." Eleanor staggered backward, her breath catching as the air thickened with the weight of the past. "Stop," she pleaded, her voice raw. "He hasn't done anything." The figure moved toward Daniel, a tendril of darkness wrapping around his throat, lifting him from the ground. He struggled, his fingers clawing at something unseen, his eyes wide but unwavering. Another will fall, just as the others did. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had spent her life accepting this fate, believing there was no other way. But as she watched Daniel, gasping, refusing to look away from her even in the grip of death, something inside her shattered. "No," she whispered. Then louder, and oh. She stepped forward, grabbing Daniel's arm, the shadows burning against her skin, and for the first time in over a century, she fought back. Eleanor had spent more than a century bowing to the will of the curse, a silent prisoner to fate's cruelty, but as she stood in the dim candlelight, watching Daniel struggle for breath, something deep within her rebelled. No longer was she the girl who had once begged for time. No longer was she the woman who watched love turn to ash in her hands. She was something else now, something stronger, something unwilling to let destiny take another soul. The house trembled around her, the darkness coiling tighter around Daniel's throat. But Eleanor did not cower. She stepped forward, ignoring the burning cold that crawled up her skin. And for the first time, she did not beg the entity for mercy. "Enough," she said, her voice steady, commanding, filled with the weight of all she had lost. The shadows hissed, resisting, but Eleanor did not falter. "I have lived in your grip long enough. I have suffered, I have grieved, I have obeyed. No more." A wind howled through the mansion, rattling the stained-glass windows. But Eleanor did not flinch. "You have taken enough from me," she continued, staring into the abyss that had ruled her life. "You will take no more." And then, without hesitation, she reached out, gripping the darkness itself, her fingers sinking into the writhing void, her very essence defying the thing that had stolen everything from her. Pain lanced through her chest, a fire spreading through her veins, but she did not let go. She had made her choice, and the curse, for the first time in history, recoiled. The house screamed. The walls cracked. The very air groaned under the weight of something ancient and enraged. Eleanor had always believed the curse was untouchable and unmovable force, but now she understood the truth. It only held power because she had given it power. It was a chain she had accepted, a burden she had carried willingly, and now, as she stood there, tearing into the fabric of the darkness, she saw the price of her defiance. The curse would not let her go without cost. It would not simply fade. If it could not have Daniel, then it would take her instead. A searing heat engulfed her chest, a force so strong it drove her to her knees. But she did not cry out. This was how it had to end. She had lived too long, loved too briefly, lost too much. If fate demanded a sacrifice, she would give herself freely. Eleanor turned to Daniel, who had collapsed onto the floor, gasping, his eyes wild with panic. "Run," she whispered, a soft plea, a final mercy. But Daniel, stubborn as ever, shook his head, crawling toward her even as the house roared in fury. "I won't leave you," he said, voice ragged, raw. But Eleanor only smiled, a small, sad thing, filled with more warmth than she had felt in over 100 years. "You must." The shadows surged toward her, wrapping around her form like a lover's embrace, pulling her into their depths. And then, just as she had once whispered a wish for eternity, she whispered something new. "Let him go. Take me instead." The darkness hesitated. Then, slowly it obeyed. The silence was deafening. The house stood still, its anger spent, its walls no longer trembling under the weight of restless spirits. The darkness had vanished, swallowed into the depths of the mansion, and with it, Eleanor. Daniel staggered to his feet, his breath unsteady, his mind reeling. She was gone, the woman who had stood in the shadows for more than a century, who had feared love and yet loved so deeply, had sacrificed herself for him. He wanted to scream, to rage, to call her name, and demand she return. But the house was empty now. The curse had been fed. It was over, or so he thought. As he turned to leave, his hands shaking, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the large, dust-covered mirror that hung above the fireplace. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped toward it. His reflection stared back at him, exhausted, battered, but alone. Eleanor was not there. He exhaled a shuddering breath, ready to turn away. When he saw it, just for a second, a fleeting moment, His reflection shifted, and standing beside him was a woman. Not a ghost, not a shadow, but Eleanor. But she was different now. Her once youthful skin bore the faintest hint of age, a streak of silver in her raven black hair. Her expression was neither sorrowful nor afraid. It was peaceful. And then she was gone. Daniel did not stay in the house after that night. He could not. It belonged to Eleanor, to the past, to the history that would now rest in peace. He returned to town, carrying the weight of what had happened in his heart, but something strange awaited him. The whispers had stopped, the fearful glances, the hushed warnings, the town's deep-rooted terror. They were gone. It was as if, without Eleanor's presence in the mansion, the fear itself had died. The children no longer ran past the iron gate in nervous laughter. The townspeople no longer spoke her name in fearful reverence. Instead, a quiet respect settled over them, an understanding that whatever curse had plagued their town had ended the night Daniel walked out of that house alone. But Daniel knew the truth. The curse had not vanished. It had changed. It had been rewritten, reshaped by the one person who had suffered from it the most. Eleanor Vale was no longer a legend of tragedy. She was a story of sacrifice, of redemption, of a woman who had chosen love over fear, freedom over eternity. And the town, whether they knew it or not, had been forever changed by her final act. Years passed, and Daniel did what he always did. He wrote. He documented the tale of Eleanor Vale, not as a ghost story, not as a warning, but as a love story unlike any other. His book became a quiet sensation, passed from hands to hands. Its pages filled with the weight of sorrow and hope, of curses and choices, of a woman who had spent a lifetime believing she could never love without loss, until she proved herself wrong. But even as the years wore on, even as Daniel moved on, he never forgot. He often found himself staring at reflections, half expecting to see her standing there, watching over him. He never did. But sometimes, on nights when the air was still and the world felt too quiet, he swore he could hear a whisper in the wind, soft, distant, familiar. "You were right." And he would close his eyes, smile, and whisper back, "I know."